So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stefan Tanase. I'm a senior security researcher, part of the Kaspersky Global Research and Analysis team. We're basically a team of 35 experts spread out all over the world. For myself, I'm based in Bucharest, Romania, and it's always a pleasure for me to come here to Budapest. I was actually here at this conference 2 years ago, and it's a very nice crowd and a very nice place to be. We don't have conferences, IT conferences as big as this one back home in Romania. So, in my presentation today, I'm going to talk to you about the most interesting things that we see. I've been in this industry for 7 years now, since 2007, and I've basically seen the whole threat landscape change from everything that was cybercrime to what we have right now, which is more sophisticated and more advanced attacks. If we look at the evolution of malware in the past years, we noticed a huge growth. Like in 1994, 20 years ago, if you would work in an antivirus company in research, you could barely analyze about 20 new viruses per day. So we can barely see that. We can barely say that in 1994 one new virus would appear every hour. Now, if you fast forward to 2006, we moved from one new virus every hour to one new virus every minute. Now, I'm saying viruses, but what I mean here is, malware, like viruses, trojans, adware, spyware, etc. 2 years ago, in 2012, Kaspersky Lab processed one new virus every second, which basically means 100,000 new and unique malicious software samples per day. And what about 2014, you might ask? 2014, it's a year in which our research team is currently processing more than 300,000 unique samples every day. Actually, this number was from the beginning of this year. We're now getting closer and closer to the end of the year, and I can tell you that it's already bigger, close to like almost 400,000. So we see the malware, doubling in numbers every year, but at the same time, it's also growing in complexity. It's also becoming more and more advanced, more and more sophisticated. And like I was telling you in the beginning of the presentation, the most advanced things that we see nowadays are basically malware, which is being used in cyber warfare, in cyber espionage or cyber sabotage operations that are, financed, sponsored, started, and sustained by governments all over the world. So these things like espionage has definitely moved online nowadays, and the tools that we see governments implementing for this are the most sophisticated ones. This is basically the main difference between cyber criminals and governments. Cyber criminals were always interested in money, so they were developing malware and exploits and trying to infect as many computers as possible to generate some sort of financial gain for themselves. But nation states around the world, they're not interested in money. At least they're not interested in getting money by writing malware. They're interested in doing their espionage and sabotage operations by using the newest tools that are available online. So this whole thing, actually started with Operation Aurora. It's the first cyber attack that we know of that was published, that we know that it was state-sponsored. It was actually the reason why Google decided to quit, to stop trying to enter the Chinese market in 2009. And back then in 2009, if you would ask people like me or like my colleagues, researchers from other companies or from the academic environment, do you actually think that there are governments out there that are, writing malware and launching cyber attacks? We would say that, something like this is just a conspiracy theory. It couldn't be happening because the things that we are protecting used to look something like this, just random desktops or laptops belonging to random people who don't necessarily know what to click on, what not to click on, what file to open or what file not to open. But then in 2010, we realized that what we might be protecting looks something like this, power plants, airline control systems, automation, factories, air conditioning, fans, and this whole thing was caused by Stuxnet, by the discovery of Stuxnet in 2010 by a small Belarusian company called Virus Blockada. I'm not going to go into many details about Stuxnet. What I want you to know is that we estimate the investment size, the money that was being spent to develop Stuxnet, all of its modules, and the framework that it was built on, to in the range of tens of millions of dollars. So we basically estimated between 10 million and 100 million. It's a very long project for many years with many people and many developers, very advanced developers getting involved in this. Just for you to estimate, to get an idea of the size and scope of these nation-state operations. And Stuxnet is basically the first cyber weapon that was discovered. Why are we saying cyber weapon? We're saying cyber weapon because it basically has two modules. One module which was meant for sabotage, and one module which was meant for transporting the malware. They actually had to use 4 zero-day vulnerabilities and infected more than 100,000 computers around the world to get their malware inside that specific computer in the Natanz uranium enrichment plant in Iran. So this is the cyber weapon concept. You know, you transport it, you go there, and you execute the sabotage payload, and you know, you have a successful operation. 1 year later, in 2011, Mr. Boldy from the Crisis Lab here in Budapest discovered Duku, which was a very sophisticated, elusive, and stealthy cyber espionage, not cyber sabotage tool. We believe that information that was stolen by Duku was later used in the creation of the Stuxnet variant that was actually successful in sabotaging those centrifuges at the uranium enrichment plant. 2012 came, and in April there were many reports on the internet about a mysterious attack called the Wiper. It was an attack that supposedly completely wiped out a couple of, many hard drives in the Middle Eastern region. And we at Kaspersky Lab, together with other researchers from other companies, we strived to find this mysterious piece of malware. Nobody has ever seen the sample of it. Nobody was able to discover it or to confirm the reports. But what we were able to find during the search for Wiper was a totally different thing and a much more interesting thing. It was an operation dubbed Flame. We called it Flame. This was discovered by Kaspersky Lab in 2012. And we called it Flame because actually the authors of the malware called it Flame. It was a very modular and very complex framework for cyber espionage. It infected around 1,000 users in the Middle Eastern area. I'm not going to go into details about all of the modules, of course, but what I want you to remember about Flame was how ingenious its spreading mechanism was inside the local network. Because Flame was basically the first piece of malware that was able to use the Windows updating system in order to infect computers in a local network. And I remember in 2012, before we discovered Flame at the beginning of the year, I was discussing with a journalist at a press conference the importance of always installing updates, always installing patches, never clicking on remind me later. And the journalist asked me a very interesting question. He said, so Stefan, do you think there can be a virus that could infect your computer through the update? And I told him, this is totally not possible. I mean, every update that gets installed on your system has to be digitally signed with, with Microsoft certificates. So if anyone could build a virus that could infect your computer through an update, they would have to get their hands on the private keys used to sign those executable files. So what the people behind Flame managed to do was they managed to find a hash collision, which allowed them to generate a malicious file that had the same signature, the same hash as the Windows update. Now, I'm not a specialist in cryptography, but I've talked to some cryptographers in the past years, and they've been telling me that this type of attack can only be done by, maybe 10 or 20 people around the world, world-class expert cryptographers, provided that they also have enough resources, enough computer power to brute force all of these files and generate this. So this thing was discovered independently at the same time by both Kaspersky and the Crisis Lab here in Budapest, and we're very glad to work with our colleagues at the Budapest University Crisis Lab. Now, Flame, as I told you, was also a piece of malware that was heavily targeting the Middle Eastern area. Most of the infections were found in Iran and Israel and Palestinian territories. And later that year, while we were digging more for similar things by using our similarity algorithms and digging through our malware collection database, we also found another related piece of malware dubbed GOS with a main purpose which is still unknown. The main module which was activated on a specific computer would activate itself, would decrypt itself only if it would find a special string that was only available on that specific computer. So we don't know the main purpose of GOS. What we know was the region where it was found, again, Middle East, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, very, let's say, hot territories when it comes to intelligence gathering. And what was very impressive about GOS was that it was the first nation-state sponsored malware that also contained a online banking Trojan component. And when we found this, we were actually pretty excited. We said, hey, maybe we managed to find a cyber espionage operation that finances itself by stealing money from the victims from the people that they're actually spying on. Later turned out that they weren't actually stealing the money, but they were using the online banking Trojan component to monitor the financial transactions that were happening in that specific area. So they were basically monitoring the money that the victims were transferring between each other. Now, I wanted to tell you about all of these things, Stuxnet, Duku, Flame, and Gauss, even though not all of them were discovered by Kaspersky, just the last two of them. But I wanted to mention them because all of them are related. And when I say that the people behind Stuxnet spent tens of millions of dollars on Stuxnet, you have to understand that that investment, that money, didn't only go into Stuxnet, because these four pieces of malware, they share different modules and they share the same frameworks. Like Stuxnet and Duku were built on the Tilted platform, while Flame and Gauss were built on the Flame platform, but they share, things like USB spreading modules or auto-run modules between each other. So they clearly come from the same government or from the same group of governments. Now, we're getting closer to the present date. At the beginning of last year, the beginning of 2013, Kaspersky Lab made a huge announcement called Red October. We published, as far as I remember, like a 100 pages report about this cyber espionage operation. We actually called it Red October because the whole story started in October 2012 when we received a disk image from one of our customers in a European Union country. And it took us, 2.5 months just for you to get an idea of how complex these cyber espionage operations are and how hard it is to actually analyze and to manage to find out all of the details. Red October was a worldwide reaching cyber espionage operation, mostly targeting Windows computers and targeting mostly governmental institutions, embassies, and research organizations, mostly related to the energy sector. Again, lots of interesting file names used in the attack. Most of the attacks, the most common infection vector was actually spear phishing. This is an example of a document used in the spear phishing campaign to attack one of the embassies inside the European Union. Again, very modular. We managed to discover more than 1,000 unique modules of Red October, divided into 34 categories, like for initial infection, for lateral movement, for exfiltrating data, even modules that were able to recover deleted files from a USB stick. Like when you try to transfer something from a computer that's not connected to the internet to a computer that is connected to the internet, you usually use a memory stick to jump the air gap. I'm not going to go into details about all of the modules. I just want to mention two of them, which I believe are the most interesting ones. The file stealing module was targeting files used by two very interesting applications. One of them is called Acid Cryptofiller. It has been developed by the Ministry of Defense in France, and it is heavily being used inside NATO at the moment to encrypt critical communications. Red October was trying to steal these encryption keys. At the same time, they were targeting another crypto software called Chiasmus. How many of you have heard of Chiasmus? I haven't heard of Chiasmus either until analyzing Red October. But if you look on Wikipedia, you can see that Chiasmus is a software developed by the German BSI, the German Intelligence Services, and it is heavily being used both in NATO structures and also inside the European Union, European Commission, again to encrypt very, very critical communications. So the attackers behind Red October were definitely interested in breaking the crypto that we're trying to use in order to secure our communications. And actually, all of the threat actors at the moment are very interested in that, as encryption is becoming more and more ubiquitous. Probably the most interesting module from Red October was called Zakladka. Zakladka is a Russian word that during the Cold War was used to define those microphones that were hidden inside walls of embassies. And the Red October attackers used this Zakladka name to name an injected malicious file that they were transferring onto mobile phones that were connected to infected computers. And once this module has been injected inside the mobile phone, it would allow the attackers to remotely turn on and off the microphone and to listen to the sounds in the room where the phone was located. So this is how they do, room sound interception nowadays. Later in 2013, we managed to discover NetTraveler, another very interesting cyber espionage operation. We believe that the investment required for NetTraveler was much more smaller than what happened with Red October or with Stuxnet and all of his friends. Again, targets reaching very interesting targets, companies that are dealing with sensitive industries such as nanotech or lasers or nuclear power cells. And it shows that it's becoming more and more cheaper, to get your hands on information from all around the world by using cyber attacks, which is the reason why we're seeing more and more cyber espionage operations. IceFog, again, we believe that this group is not necessarily state-sponsored, but they mostly do corporate espionage. They have a totally different approach than the classic APT. APT stands for Advanced Persistent Threat, meaning that the attacker is advanced enough to penetrate your network, and then once it penetrated the network, it wants to persist in there for as many years as possible and try to suck up all the information from inside the network. Now, IceFog has a totally different approach. We call them cyber mercenaries because what they do is basically they do hit and run operations. Once they manage to compromise the network, they know exactly what they're looking for, they get their hands on their data, and then they get out. So if you don't manage to catch them in that a few weeks period in which they are operating, you'll never be able to catch them again. So they're mostly targeting the supply chain, and the most interesting thing about these people is that we also found evidence that they're also targeting Mac computers, Mac users, so not just Windows. These are some screenshots from the victims of IceFog from their websites. The latest announcement that the first announcement that we made this year, because we're doing these things once every few months, is the mask. It's called the mask, and this is the first cyber espionage operation that we managed to find proof that it can attack both Linux, Windows, and Mac computers. So the conclusion that I want you to remember after seeing this presentation is that cyber espionage operations are not the exception, they're actually the rule. And every year that comes, we keep discovering more and more of these underground operations sponsored by governments all over the world. And actually, this is not necessarily news. I mean, it is news. You can see it in the news. For example, this article saying that the Swedish army wants to have the right to launch cyber offensive attacks. And Sweden is just an example. Basically, every country in the world that has quite an advanced military right now, they are already launching, or they're already prepared of launching cyber offensive campaigns. And it's like a global cyber arms game at the moment, with the cost of APT totally decreasing year after year. It's cheaper and cheaper to launch these kinds of attacks, and it's definitely cheaper to do cyber espionage than to do real-life espionage, where you have to send agents to give them a cover, to provide them budgets, and to risk their lives in the end. We're starting to see attacks targeting the supply chain. We're starting to see larger and larger operations that have greater and greater precision. And of course, critical infrastructure attacks are becoming a more common thing nowadays. I'd like to end the presentation with why we think that cyber war is dangerous. We definitely understand that everybody is doing it right now, but we are definitely against these types of operations for three very basic reasons. The first one is that the ideas used in cyber attacks can be copied and repurposed. We call this the Boomerang Effect. It's the main difference between a real-life weapon and a cyber weapon. With a real-life weapon, you cannot repurpose it and launch it back at the country that first launched it. The second reason is that companies and individual users are becoming collateral victims of this cyber war between superpowers. And last but not least, we start seeing cyber criminals using weaponized exploits that were initially developed for cyber weapons. I'm going to give you an example for each of these reasons. I told you about the Boomerang Effect. You remember the wiper story from Iran. Later in the same year, the same thing happened in Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Aramco, the national oil and gas company, was hit by a mysterious malware called Shamoon, which at one point wiped more than 30,000 hard drives. They basically rendered those computers useless. And the next year, we saw the same type of attacks in South Korea, where hard drives belonging to banks and TV networks in that country were again completely wiped by a piece of malware at the same time. So this is how easy it is to copy the ideas and to repurpose them for different operations. I told you about the collateral victims, and you work in IT, I work in IT. Every business nowadays has to rely on IT in order to function. We have to do online payments, we have to do online conferences, we have to send emails, etc., etc. So we take all of these technologies for granted without realizing that cyber espionage operations or cyber sabotage operations can also affect us. I told you that Stuxnet had to infect more than 1,000 computers around the world in order to get to that specific computer where the sabotage routine was activated. Now, one of the victims of Stuxnet was Chevron. They actually admitted it 2 years after the Stuxnet incident became public. They admitted the fact that some of their computers were also hit by Stuxnet. Now, the thing is, of course, nothing bad happened to them because Stuxnet was a piece of malware that was very well written, very well designed by real professional developers. So the sabotage module only activated itself where it should have activated itself. Now, what I want you to realize is that the same piece of malware can be developed by, let's say, other governments, let's say the Romanian government, which, of course, would have worse developers and they might make mistakes. And the thing is that most of our world right now, especially in urban areas, is being controlled by PLCs, by automation systems. And the thing is, our critical infrastructure is pretty fragile, and we can easily imagine a piece of malware being developed by other people who are not as professional as the Stuxnet developers, and with a sabotage routine that might go wrong, might initiate itself in a place where it shouldn't have. The last example I told you about the commercialization of weaponized exploits. And these are actually some numbers from KSN, from the Kaspersky security network. 2 years ago in December, we noticed a huge spike in the detections of CVE 2011-3402. Now, this is the same vulnerability that was used by Duku. It's a Duku exploit. What basically happened here is after Duku was discovered, some time passed, and some cyber criminals used the same vulnerability that was discovered with Duku in order to attack and infect individual users. So we're basically seeing the results of the R&D, the research efforts that governments spend money on in order to develop these cyber espionage operations being taken by ordinary cyber criminals that are just attacking, ordinary users like you or me or my grandmother, for example. So these things, unfortunately, are not really going away inside corporate environments. Unfortunately, we still have to use technologies that are known to have something in common, exploits, things like Java, like Adobe Reader, like Internet Explorer. Unfortunately, this is the world that we currently live in. And at the same time, we have to understand the fact that it's not just about cyber criminals anymore. It's also about other types of attackers, more advanced attackers, attackers that have literally, practically unlimited budgets and unlimited patience to penetrate our networks and to attack our infrastructure. So it's very hard nowadays for companies to basically understand what their threats are, and it's very hard for them to protect their IT perimeters. Now, I'm not a salesperson. I just want to mention that against these military-grade weapons, you want to have the best defensive technologies available. And unfortunately, many people still think that antiviruses are, just a reactive technology. This hasn't been true for, almost 10 years now, ever since heuristics started to get developed. And nowadays, the reason why, antiviruses are becoming more and more complex is because they're not actually antiviruses anymore. This is why we call them internet security solutions, because we do quite a lot of things. Like we even, for example, Kaspersky Lab discovers zero-day exploits quite regularly through our automatic exploit prevention technologies. We have things such as whitelisting and default deny, which can allow you to basically lock down a system and to only allow certain applications to run on it, making sure that nothing from the outside, no matter what that is, it can be something that our lab, our researchers haven't even seen, it will not be allowed to run. So actually, I'd like to make sure you drop by our booth whenever you have time today. And actually, my colleagues told me that I should tell you that if you complete this form, you can all get a free license, a free Kaspersky license to be used at home, on your desktop or on your laptop. And basically, this was the whole sales part of my pitch. I'm not a salesperson, I'm a researcher, and these are the ideas that I want you to remember after this presentation. The first one is that malware is definitely going to continue growing as long as attackers can make a profit out of it, as long as governments can reach their geopolitical or strategic goals by developing malware, malware is going to continue to be developed. We're seeing that attacks are definitely moving towards, other platforms, not just Windows. We're starting to see a lot of malware targeting mobile phones, Android mostly. We're seeing a lot of malware targeting macOS and also, Linux devices. And last but not least, we have to get used with the idea that cyber espionage and cyber sabotage are not going to get away. And what I want you to remember is that, after the Snowden leaks of last summer, I'm sure that more and more people are more cautious about the way they communicate, the way they send their data over the internet, because we know that everything is monitored. So encryption is becoming ubiquitous. And I'm worried that we'll all reach one day in which encryption tools will be available for everybody. Everybody will use super secure communications. And then how will the governments get their hands on our communications? They will have to go to the only place where the communications are not encrypted, and that's on the endpoint. That's where the place where you actually type the conversation and the place where you actually see the conversation. And the only way to get their hands on that information will be through malware, through cyber espionage campaigns that will infect computers. And this is why we believe that anti-malware technologies and anti-malware researchers are going to have quite some fun in the following years. So thank you very much for paying attention. It's always a pleasure to be here, and have fun at the conference. Thank you.